This old hag only adds to our grocery bills. Honestly, I don't know why she's still sitting at this table, my daughter-in-law said with a laugh that floated across the dining room as casually as if she were commenting on the weather. The room went quiet. Forks paused halfway to mouths. Ice shifted softly in crystal glasses. For a moment, I thought perhaps I had misunderstood her. At 69 years old, my hearing wasn't what it used to be, but humiliation has a way of sharpening every sense. I looked up from the mashed potatoes I'd spent the afternoon making from scratch and found Vanessa smiling as though she'd delivered the evening's most entertaining joke. My son, Michael, sat beside her. His eyes lowered to his plate. He didn't correct her. He didn't tell her to stop. He didn't even look at me. The scent of roasted turkey, rosemary stuffing, and fresh-baked dinner rolls still lingered in the air of the dining room I'd helped decorate for Thanksgiving after Thomas and I moved into this house nearly 35 years ago. Family photographs lined the walls. School portraits. Christmas mornings. Beach vacations. The story of a family built one sacrifice at a time. I had believed those photographs represented something permanent. Something stronger than changing circumstances or difficult seasons. I had spent decades packing lunches, sewing Halloween costumes, wading up through fevers and heartbreaks, stretching every dollar so Michael could attend college without carrying the burden of debt. I remembered clipping coupons beneath the kitchen light after working double shifts at the library. I remembered missing vacations because braces and textbooks mattered more. I remembered Thomas squeezing my hand late at night and saying, "One day we'll sit back and enjoy the family we've built." I wondered what he would think if he could see us now. Vanessa lifted her wine glass. "What?" she asked with exaggerated innocence. "Did I say something wrong?" We're all thinking it. Nobody wants to admit it. A nervous chuckle escaped from Michael's sister-in-law before she quickly looked away. Someone shifted uncomfortably in their chair. The grandfather clock in the hallway seemed louder than usual, each tick marking the distance between the woman I thought I was in this family and the woman they had apparently decided I had become. A burden. An inconvenience. An extra plate at the table. I set my fork down carefully beside my china plate. My hands remained steady, even though my chest tightened in a way I hadn't felt since the day we buried Thomas 3 years earlier. I waited. I gave Michael the opportunity every mother believes her child deserves. I waited for him to look at his wife and say enough. I waited for him to remember who had held his hand on the first day of kindergarten when he cried because he was afraid. I waited for him to remember who worked weekends so he could attend summer baseball camp. Instead, he cleared his throat and offered a weak smile that never reached his eyes. "Vanessa didn't mean it like that, Mom," he said quietly. "Let's just enjoy dinner. Let's just enjoy dinner." As though dignity could be brushed aside between bites of turkey and cranberry sauce. As though embarrassment was simply another side dish to pass around the table. I looked at the faces surrounding me and realized something far more painful than Vanessa's words. This wasn't the first time they had seen me as less important. It was simply the first time someone had said it out loud. I folded my napkin neatly onto the table and offered a small smile that surprised even me. "Of course," I said softly. "Please don't let me ruin the meal." And as I lifted my water glass and glanced around the room one more time, I understood that the cruelest thing spoken that evening wasn't Vanessa's insult. It was the silence that followed it. The rest of dinner passed beneath a fragile layer of forced normalcy, the kind families create when they are desperate to pretend nothing important has happened. Someone complimented the sweet potatoes. Someone else asked whether the local football team still had a chance at the playoffs this season. Silverware clinked softly against china while conversation floated around me without ever quite reaching me. I nodded when expected. I offered the gravy when someone requested it. I smiled at the appropriate moments. Years of motherhood had taught me how to smooth rough edges and preserve celebrations for everyone else's comfort. Yet as I looked around the table, I realized I had spent most of my life translating other people's needs while quietly editing my own existence into something smaller and easier to accommodate. Michael laughed politely at one of his brother-in-law's stories, but he never once met my eyes. Vanessa leaned comfortably into her chair, relaxed and satisfied, occasionally brushing an invisible crumb from the tablecloth as though she had not altered the atmosphere of the entire evening. The grandchildren, blissfully unaware of the undercurrents adults create, talked excitedly about upcoming school activities and holiday wish lists. I listened to 8-year-old Lily describe her science fair project with enthusiastic hand gestures, and remembered helping Michael build a model of the solar system using painted foam balls spread across our kitchen table. Thomas had hung fishing line from the ceiling, so the planets appeared suspended in space. Michael had won second place and hugged us both so tightly that I thought my heart would burst from pride. The memory arrived unexpectedly, warm and sharp all at once. It occurred to me that love does not disappear overnight. Sometimes it fades gradually beneath routines, assumptions, and the influence of stronger personalities until one day you struggle to recognize its shape. After dessert, I carried empty serving dishes into the kitchen. The familiar motions steadied me. Running warm water over plates. Wrapping leftover pie in plastic wrap. Drying my hands with the dish towel embroidered with autumn leaves that Grace had given me years ago. Through the doorway, I could hear Vanessa speaking in a low voice to Michael. I could not make out every word, only fragments drifting into the kitchen between pauses in conversation. She cannot stay forever. We have our own life. Something has to change. Michael answered too quietly for me to hear. I stood at the sink staring out the dark kitchen window above it. My reflection looked older than I remembered. Silver hair tucked neatly behind my ears. Fine lines tracing the corners of my eyes. A woman who had spent decades believing that usefulness determined worth. I thought of the afternoons I drove across town to pick up children from soccer practice when babysitters canceled. The countless birthday gifts carefully chosen and wrapped. The emergency loans never discussed again. The casseroles delivered after illnesses. The holidays planned down to the smallest detail so everyone else could simply arrive and enjoy themselves. I had never kept score because love was never supposed to be transactional. Yet standing there beneath the soft yellow light above the sink, I wondered when gratitude had quietly transformed into expectation and expectation into resentment. By the time I returned to the dining room with fresh coffee, several guests had already begun gathering coats and purses. Farewells filled the air. Hugs were exchanged. Promises to get together soon floated easily from person to person. Vanessa thanked everyone for coming with the confidence of someone presiding over her own kingdom. Michael walked relatives to the front door. No one mentioned what had happened earlier. No one apologized. As I slipped on my cardigan and reached for my handbag, I understood something that settled heavily but clearly within me. The cruelest wounds in families are rarely caused by strangers. They come from the people who know exactly how much silence can hurt because they once knew exactly how much love you had to give. The drive home that evening felt longer than the usual 20 minutes, even though every traffic light seemed determined to stay green. Streetlights cast soft pools of gold across the windshield, while familiar neighborhoods drifted past in silence. Christmas decorations had already begun appearing on front porches. White lights wrapped around maple trees. Inflatable snowmen swayed gently in front yards. Families were preparing for celebrations and traditions, and I wondered when I had stopped feeling like I belonged inside those pictures. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the house greeted me with the same quiet dignity it always had. Thomas had painted the front door navy blue the summer before he retired. He insisted that every home should have one detail that made people smile before they even stepped inside. I stood there for a moment with my keys in my hand, looking at the porch swing he built himself nearly 15 years ago. We had spent countless evenings sitting there with glasses of iced tea, talking about everything and nothing while the cicadas sang through humid July nights. Back then, growing old together had seemed like a promise instead of a privilege. Inside, the house smelled faintly of cinnamon from the candles I had lit that morning before leaving for dinner. I hung my cardigan by the door and slipped off my shoes, placing them neatly beside the entryway rug Thomas had always teased me about straightening every single day. The silence that greeted me felt different now. Not empty exactly. Honest, perhaps. There was no need to pretend within these walls. I moved through familiar rooms, turning off lamps one by one until I reached the living room. Family photographs lined the mantel above the fireplace. Michael holding his first bicycle without training wheels. His high school graduation. The day he married Vanessa beneath an arch of white roses while Thomas wiped tears from his eyes and whispered that our son had found happiness. I picked up the silver-framed photograph from their wedding and studied Michael's expression. He had looked so young, hopeful, grateful. I tried to pinpoint the moment when our conversations had shifted from effortless to cautious. At first, I blamed adulthood. Careers become demanding. Children require attention. Life pulls people in different directions. Then there had been little changes. Birthdays rescheduled without asking if I was available. Holidays shortened because Vanessa's family needed equal time. Invitations arriving later and later until they felt more like obligations than genuine gestures. If I offered advice, it was dismissed as outdated. If I remained quiet, my silence became evidence that I had nothing valuable to contribute. I remembered bringing homemade soup after Lily was born because Vanessa had been exhausted and overwhelmed. She thanked me politely while reorganizing my containers before placing them back into my hands. I remembered offering to watch the children during summer break only to hear that they had already enrolled in expensive camps. I remembered learning about family outings through social media photographs posted days later. Each moment had seemed too small to question on its own. Tiny disappointments. Harmless misunderstandings. Looking back now, they formed a trail leading somewhere I had refused to see. I lowered myself into Thomas's old recliner and pulled the knitted blanket across my lap. The clock on the wall read 10:23. Outside, rain had begun tapping softly against the windows. I glanced toward the side table where my phone rested beside an unread mystery novel. No messages. No apology from Michael. No acknowledgement that anything unusual had happened at all. The realization settled over me with surprising calm. This was not about one careless comment made during an uncomfortable dinner. It was about years of becoming smaller in other people's lives so they could feel larger in their own. I closed my eyes and listened to the rain. Somewhere deep beneath the hurt and confusion, another feeling quietly emerged for the first time. It was not anger. It was clarity. And clarity, I would soon discover, changes everything. The next morning arrived wrapped in the soft gray light of an overcast sky, and for the first time in months, I did not rush to fill every quiet moment with errands or obligations. I brewed coffee the way Thomas had taught me decades ago, measuring each scoop carefully because he insisted that small rituals mattered. The familiar aroma drifted through the kitchen while rain continued tapping gently against the windows. I carried my mug to the breakfast nook overlooking the backyard and watched droplets slide down the glass. The bird feeder Thomas had built still hung from the old oak tree, attracting cardinals and sparrows regardless of the season. Life, I thought, had a way of continuing even when people disappointed you. My gaze drifted toward the cedar chest tucked beneath the hallway table. Thomas had handcrafted it during the winter after Michael left for college. He joked that retirement needed projects and that his hands did not know how to stay idle. Inside were the keepsakes of an ordinary life that had once felt extraordinary. Letters, photographs, birthday cards, newspaper clippings. I set my coffee aside and knelt beside the chest, lifting the lid carefully. The scent of cedar wrapped around me instantly. Near the top lay a stack of old photo albums bound in worn leather. I opened one at random and found myself staring at a younger version of Thomas standing beside a station wagon packed for our first family road trip. Michael was 7 years old, grinning through missing front teeth while clutching a stuffed dinosaur beneath one arm. We had driven nearly 1,000 miles to Yellowstone National Park because Michael had become fascinated by geysers after checking out library books about volcanoes. The hotel had been modest. The food had been forgettable. Yet Thomas spent hours teaching our son how to skip stones across rivers and identify constellations beneath the Wyoming sky. We had not possessed much money back then, but our home overflowed with certainty. We knew who we were to one another. I turned another page and found photographs from Michael's high school graduation. Thomas wore the same navy suit he reserved for weddings and funerals. I remembered how proud he looked sitting in the bleachers beneath the June sun. Michael had been accepted into an excellent university, and although tuition terrified us, Thomas never hesitated. We refinanced the house. I worked additional evening shifts at the library. Thomas postponed retirement by 3 years. Opportunity is an investment, he told me whenever I worried about bills. One day, he will understand what love costs. I traced my fingers lightly over Thomas's smiling face in the photograph and wondered whether either of us had prepared Michael too well for receiving without teaching him how to recognize sacrifice when it stood quietly before him. Beneath the albums rested a small bundle of letters tied together with blue ribbon. Thomas had written them throughout our marriage, leaving notes in lunch bags, suitcases, and dresser drawers. I untied the ribbon and unfolded one dated nearly 10 years earlier. Evelyn, if you are reading this, I hope I remembered to tell you today how grateful I am for the life we built together. Families grow and change, but promise me one thing. Never allow yourself to disappear, trying to make everyone else comfortable. You deserve the same kindness you give so freely. Tears blurred the familiar handwriting. Thomas had always noticed truths before I did. He understood that love required generosity, but not self-erasure. I sat there surrounded by decades of memories and realized that somewhere along the way, I had mistaken endurance for virtue. I had tolerated dismissive remarks to keep peace, minimized hurt feelings to avoid conflict, accepted shrinking invitations because I did not want to seem demanding. Piece by piece, accommodation had become invisibility. I folded the letter carefully and pressed it against my heart. Outside, the rain had finally stopped. Sunlight slipped through the clouds and stretched across the kitchen floor in narrow bands of gold. And sitting there in the quiet house Thomas had filled with laughter and steady devotion, I understood that perhaps the greatest betrayal had not been failing to see how others had changed. It had been forgetting that I was still worthy of the respect I had spent a lifetime offering to everyone else. 3 days passed before I heard the knock at my front door. The late November air had turned crisp enough to send most people hurrying indoors, and I had just finished raking the last of the oak leaves into careful piles along the edge of the yard. I wiped my hands on my gardening gloves and opened the door to find Grace Thompson standing on my porch, balancing a cardboard tray of coffee cups in one hand and a white paper bag from the bakery downtown in the other. Grace had been my closest friend for more than 40 years. We had met at the public library during a children's reading program when Michael was still in elementary school. She had seen me through Thomas's unexpected job layoffs, Michael's teenage rebellion, my mother's passing, and the long months after Thomas died. If anyone could read the truth behind a polite smile, it was Grace. I brought cinnamon rolls, she said simply, studying my face with concern. And before you tell me you are fine, let me save us both some time and say that I do not believe you. Despite everything, a quiet laugh escaped me. Some people arrive carrying flowers. Grace arrived carrying honesty. We settled at the kitchen table while steam rose from our coffee cups and the scent of warm cinnamon filled the room. For a while, we talked about ordinary things. The weather forecast predicting an early snowfall, rising grocery prices, her grandson's obsession with dinosaurs. Then Grace folded her hands around her coffee cup and looked directly at me. I ran into Denise Harper yesterday, she said carefully. Denise worked as an administrator at one of the senior living communities on the outskirts of town. My stomach tightened almost immediately, though I could not explain why. She asked how you were adjusting, Grace continued. When I looked confused, she apologized and said she thought everyone already knew. The kitchen suddenly felt too warm. Knew what? I asked, my voice quieter than I intended. Grace hesitated for only a moment. Evelyn, Denise said Vanessa toured their facility twice over the past month. She asked detailed questions about available units, pricing, medical support, and waiting lists. She mentioned that your family hoped to make arrangements soon. For several seconds, I simply stared at her. The ticking of the clock above the refrigerator grew impossibly loud. I thought about the fragments of conversation I had overheard after dinner. She cannot stay forever. Something has to change. I thought about Michael's silence. The invitations that had grown less frequent. The subtle suggestions that perhaps I should consider downsizing someday. My fingers tightened around the ceramic mug. Are you certain? I finally asked. Grace nodded slowly. Denise recognized Vanessa from community events. She assumed the family had discussed it together. Together. The words settled heavily between us. I searched my memory desperately for any conversation where Michael had asked what I wanted for my future. Whether I felt safe in my own home. Whether I needed help. There had been none. Plans had apparently been made without the inconvenience of my participation. Grace reached across the table and covered my hand with hers. Evelyn, I know this is painful to hear, but I need you to listen carefully. Being kind does not require surrendering your voice. You have spent your entire life showing up for everyone else. Do not let them convince you that your presence is the problem simply because it no longer fits neatly into the life they planned. Tears gathered in my eyes, but they did not fall. Instead, I looked around the kitchen Thomas and I had renovated together one summer using borrowed tools and determination. I looked at the handwritten recipe cards taped inside cabinet doors. The pencil marks on the pantry wall tracking Michael's childhood growth spurts. The curtains I had sewn myself 20 years ago because money had been tight. This house was not simply a structure. It was evidence that my life had mattered. Grace squeezed my hand gently. "Whatever comes next," she said, "promise me one thing. Do not underestimate yourself." Sometimes the people who mistake kindness for weakness forget that the strongest women they know learned how to survive long before anyone offered them a seat at the table. And for the first time since that family dinner, I felt something shift inside me. The hurt remained. So did the disappointment. But beneath both emotions, another feeling quietly took root. I was done waiting for someone else to decide what value my life deserved. The days that followed settled into an uneasy rhythm. But something fundamental inside me had changed. I still watered the houseplants every morning. I still folded laundry fresh from the dryer and placed dishes back into cabinets with practiced precision. Outwardly, I remained the same woman everyone expected me to be. Yet beneath those familiar routines, I had stopped dismissing the quiet voice that urged me to pay attention. For years, I had explained away uncomfortable moments because love had taught me to give people the benefit of the doubt. Now I understood that clarity demanded honesty, even when honesty arrived carrying heartbreak. 2 mornings after Grace's visit, I sat at my kitchen table with a yellow legal pad and began writing down every practical detail I had neglected to examine. Monthly expenses, property taxes, insurance policies, utility bills. Thomas had always believed that understanding your circumstances was the first step toward preserving your independence. "Never sign anything you do not understand, Evelyn," he used to say, "and never surrender decisions that belong to you." I retrieved the fireproof lockbox from the hall closet shelf and carried it into the dining room. Inside were decades of organized paperwork secured in carefully labeled folders. Birth certificates, mortgage records, tax returns, the original deed to our home. I reviewed each document slowly, surprised by how comforting the process felt. Facts offered stability where emotions had become unreliable. The house remained solely in my name after Thomas passed away, exactly as we had arranged with our attorney years earlier. There had been no changes, no transfers, no signatures authorizing anyone else to make decisions on my behalf. Relief washed through me, followed almost immediately by another realization. If plans regarding my future had truly been discussed elsewhere, they had been built upon assumptions rather than permission. That afternoon, my phone rang. Michael's name illuminated the screen. For a brief moment, hope stirred despite everything. Perhaps he had reflected on our last dinner together. Perhaps he intended to apologize. I answered with cautious warmth. "Hi, sweetheart." There was a pause before he spoke. "Hi, Mom. Vanessa and I wanted to check in." Wanted. The word struck me because Vanessa's voice soon joined the conversation through speakerphone. "We have been thinking about you," she said brightly. "You know how much we care about your well-being." I listened quietly while she spoke about convenience, support systems, and planning ahead. She mentioned communities designed specifically for older adults where activities, transportation, and assistance were readily available. Her tone remained polished and pleasant. Had Grace never visited, had Denise never recognized her, perhaps I would have mistaken concern for compassion. Instead, each carefully chosen phrase settled into place with unsettling familiarity. Michael added that they only wanted what was best for me. I stared through the kitchen window at the oak tree shedding the last of its autumn leaves. "I appreciate your concern," I replied calmly. "If I ever decide I need help making those decisions, I will certainly let you know." Silence followed. Brief but unmistakable. Vanessa recovered first. "Of course," she said smoothly. "We just think it is important to be proactive." After ending the call, I remained seated for several minutes. Surprisingly, my hands did not shake. My breathing stayed steady. For the first time, I recognized the difference between being included in a conversation and being managed through one. They believed they were guiding me toward an outcome already determined. They believed kindness would keep me agreeable. They believed my reluctance to create conflict meant I lacked resolve. Later that evening, I carried a cup of tea onto the porch swing Thomas had built all those years ago. The November air carried the scent of distant fireplaces and fallen leaves. Across the street, neighbors hung wreaths on front doors while children raced bicycles beneath streetlights. I wrapped my cardigan more tightly around my shoulders and looked toward the stars beginning to emerge overhead. Thomas had once told me that dignity was not loud. It rarely announced itself. More often, it appeared quietly in moments when people expected surrender and instead encountered self-respect. I gently rocked beneath the porch light and allowed myself one final moment of grief for the version of my family I had spent years trying to preserve. Then I lifted my chin toward the darkening sky and accepted a truth I could no longer avoid. They thought they were preparing me for the next chapter of my life. What they did not understand was that I had finally decided to write it myself. The invitation arrived the following Sunday afternoon through a cheerful text message that felt strangely out of place after everything that had happened. Vanessa wrote that the family wanted to gather again before the holidays became too hectic. She mentioned homemade desserts, board games for the grandchildren, and quality time together. Reading the message, I noticed how carefully ordinary every word appeared. There was no acknowledgement of the previous dinner, no reference to uncomfortable conversations or wounded silences. According to Vanessa's version of events, nothing had happened at all. I set my phone down on the kitchen counter and stared at the blinking microwave clock. For years, I would have accepted the invitation immediately, grateful for another opportunity to preserve harmony. This time I waited. I brewed tea, folded freshly washed towels, watered the African violet resting on the windowsill above the sink. Then I picked up my phone and replied with a simple sentence. I would be happy to join you. The evening of the gathering arrived beneath a sky painted lavender and silver as winter edged closer. I chose a soft green sweater Thomas had once said brought warmth to my eyes and paired it with pearl earrings my mother had given me decades earlier. Looking into the mirror before leaving, I studied the woman reflected there. She looked composed, perhaps a little older than she felt inside, but there was steadiness in her expression that had not been there only weeks before. The drive to Michael and Vanessa's house felt familiar. Holiday wreaths decorated neighboring front doors, while strings of white lights outlined rooftops throughout the subdivision. Children laughed somewhere nearby as they chased one another through front yards bundled in oversized coats and knitted hats. Life continued in its ordinary rhythms regardless of private disappointments. When Michael opened the front door, surprise flickered across his face before he quickly smiled. "Mom, you made it," he said, stepping aside. The scent of cinnamon candles and baked ham drifted through the entryway. Lily raced over first, wrapping her small arms around my waist as she excitedly described an upcoming school concert. Her younger brother proudly announced that he had learned to ride his bicycle without training wheels. Their innocent enthusiasm softened something inside me that bitterness had threatened to harden. Children, after all, should never inherit the unfinished wounds of adults. Vanessa appeared from the kitchen carrying a serving platter. "Evelyn," she greeted pleasantly. "You look nice tonight." Her voice remained polished and effortless, as though kindness had always come naturally between us. I thanked her sincerely because I no longer needed hostility to confirm what I already understood. Around the dinner table, conversation flowed easily. Discussions shifted from holiday shopping to weather forecasts predicting snow before Christmas. Michael described a demanding project at work, while Vanessa shared plans for Lily's dance recital costume. I listened attentively and contributed where appropriate. Outwardly, everything resembled countless family dinners from years past. Yet subtle details revealed themselves now that I had stopped explaining them away. Vanessa answered questions directed toward Michael before he could respond. She redirected topics whenever practical concerns emerged. When the conversation briefly touched on future plans, she casually remarked how wonderful it would be to simplify life by eliminating unnecessary burdens. Her smile remained fixed as she sliced another piece of pie. Michael lowered his eyes to his plate once again. The old version of myself would have interpreted these moments as unfortunate habits. The woman sitting quietly at that table understood something different. Patterns become visible once you stop pretending not to see them. After dessert, Lily asked if I would help her assemble a complicated puzzle she had received as an early holiday gift. We sat together on the living room rug, sorting edge pieces while laughter drifted from the kitchen where the adults gathered. "Grandma," Lily whispered suddenly, concentrating on fitting two blue pieces together. "I like when you come over because you really listen." Her words settled gently over my heart. I smiled and brushed a strand of hair behind her ear. "Thank you, sweetheart," I replied softly. Across the room, I caught sight of Vanessa watching us with an unreadable expression before turning away. And as I placed another puzzle piece into its proper place, I realized that some truths announce themselves loudly while others reveal their shapes slowly, one small piece at a time, until the entire picture becomes impossible to ignore. As the evening drew closer to its end, the comfortable rhythm of family conversation began settling into that familiar winding down that follows a shared meal. Coffee cups replaced dessert plates. The grandchildren disappeared upstairs to retrieve jackets and school papers they wanted to show me before I left. Vanessa moved through the kitchen with practiced efficiency, stacking dishes and directing small tasks with the ease of someone accustomed to being obeyed. I stood near the dining room window for a moment, watching snowflakes begin drifting lazily through the darkness outside. The first snowfall of the season had finally arrived. There was a time when I would have considered it magical. Thomas used to wake Michael before sunrise so they could shovel the driveway together and then reward themselves with hot chocolate topped with 2 mini marshmallows. Looking at the quiet neighborhood blanketed in white, I realized memories can remain beautiful even when the people within them change. "Mom," Michael said from behind me, his tone careful. "Can we talk for a minute?" I turned and followed him back toward the dining room where Vanessa was already seated at the table. Her hands rested neatly atop a folder I had not noticed earlier in the evening. The sight of it immediately sharpened my attention. Vanessa offered a polished smile. "Please do not misunderstand this," she began smoothly. "Everything we are about to say comes from a place of love and concern." I lowered myself into the chair opposite them and folded my hands in my lap. "I am listening," I replied. Michael cleared his throat and glanced briefly at Vanessa before speaking. "Mom, we have been thinking about your future. We just want to make sure you have support as you get older." There it was again, the language of protection disguising the removal of choice. Vanessa gently pushed the folder a few inches across the table. "We gathered information about some wonderful communities," she explained. "Places where people your age can socialize, participate in activities, and receive assistance if needed. There are waiting lists, so planning ahead is important." Her voice remained warm and reasonable. Had I been the woman I was only a month earlier, I might have thanked them for their thoughtfulness while quietly swallowing my discomfort. Instead, I looked at the folder without touching it. "You have certainly done extensive research," I observed calmly. A flicker of uncertainty crossed Michael's expression. "We just want what is best for you," he repeated. I studied my son carefully. Gray now touched his temples. Fine lines appeared around eyes that had once widened with excitement whenever I arrived at school events carrying forgotten lunches or homemade cupcakes. He looked tired, torn, yet still unwilling to stand independently from the influence shaping his decisions. I shifted my gaze toward Vanessa. "Tell me," I asked softly, "when exactly were you planning to include me in this conversation?" The room grew noticeably quieter. Vanessa blinked before recovering quickly. "Evelyn, this is not meant to upset you. We assumed you would appreciate having options." "Interesting," I replied, "because usually when people appreciate having options, they are invited before the planning begins rather than after the brochures are collected." Michael's shoulders tensed. "Mom, please do not make this into something it is not." I almost smiled at the irony. For years, I had minimized my own perceptions to preserve everyone else's comfort. Now, simply acknowledging reality made me unreasonable. I finally reached for the folder and opened it. Inside were brochures featuring smiling retirees playing cards, painting landscapes, and participating in exercise classes beneath cheerful slogans promising carefree living. Tucked between them rested handwritten notes detailing pricing structures and unit availability. Vanessa had not been casually exploring possibilities. She had been preparing logistics. I closed the folder carefully and placed it back on the table. "Thank you for your concern," I said evenly. "I assure you that I have given considerable thought to my future as well." Something shifted in Vanessa's expression then. Not hostility exactly. Surprise. Perhaps for the first time, she realized the woman sitting across from her was no longer willing to drift quietly wherever others directed her. Outside, snow continued falling steadily beyond the dining room windows. Inside, I met my son's uncertain gaze without anger and without apology. They believed this conversation marked the beginning of guiding me toward decisions already made in my absence. What they had not yet realized was that I had spent the last several weeks preparing for a very different ending. For a long moment after I closed the folder, no one spoke. Snow continued drifting past the dining room windows, soft and steady against the dark December sky. Somewhere upstairs, the grandchildren laughed over a board game, their voices carrying faintly through the house. Life had a peculiar way of placing innocence beside disappointment, joy beside grief. I rested my fingertips lightly against the folder before sliding it back toward Vanessa. I understand that both of you believe you are being practical, I said quietly. But there is something you should understand as well. Michael shifted uneasily in his chair. Vanessa straightened slightly, her polite expression settling back into place like a carefully chosen accessory. I reached into my handbag and withdrew a cream-colored envelope that had rested there untouched throughout the evening. I had placed it there before leaving home, not because I wanted confrontation, but because clarity deserved witnesses. I unfolded the document carefully and laid it on the table between us. Several years before Thomas passed away, we reviewed every aspect of our finances and future plans with our attorney. We discussed healthcare decisions, legal protections, and exactly how we wished to preserve our independence for as long as possible. Michael frowned. Mom, what is this? I met his eyes with a calmness that surprised even me. It is a copy of the directives your father and I established together. It confirms that I remain fully responsible for decisions regarding my home, finances, and future care unless I personally choose otherwise. Vanessa's gaze dropped to the document before returning to my face. Evelyn, nobody is trying to take away your rights, she said smoothly. We were only offering support. I nodded gently. Support begins with conversation. Support asks questions. Support respects the person it claims to protect. The silence that followed felt different from the one after Vanessa's cruel remark weeks earlier. That silence had been heavy with humiliation. This one carried truth. Michael rubbed a hand across his face and looked older than his 42 years. Mom, he said softly, we were worried about you being alone. I studied my son and, for the first time in a very long while, allowed myself to see him clearly. He was not the little boy who ran into my arms after nightmares. He was not the teenager whose college acceptance letter we celebrated around the kitchen table. He was a grown man capable of making choices, including the choice to remain silent when his wife diminished my worth. Loving him no longer required pretending otherwise. Being alone and being lonely are not the same thing, I replied. I miss your father every single day, but I am not incapable. I am not confused. And I am certainly not invisible. Tears gathered unexpectedly in Michael's eyes. I never wanted you to feel that way. I believed him. That was perhaps the most painful part. Harm does not always arrive through malice. Sometimes it arrives through convenience, avoidance, and the willingness to let someone else speak when courage is required. Vanessa lowered her gaze to the table. For the first time since I had known her, she appeared uncertain. I thought I was helping everyone, she said quietly. I considered her words carefully before answering. Then let me help you understand something I wish I had learned much sooner. Growing older does not reduce a person's value. It does not erase wisdom, sacrifice, or dignity. One day, if you are fortunate, age will visit you too. And when it does, I hope the people around you remember who you have always been rather than treating you as an inconvenience. Upstairs, Lily called out that it had started snowing harder. The ordinary sweetness of her voice broke the tension that had filled the room. I rose slowly from my chair and gathered my handbag. I love this family, I said softly. That has never changed. But love cannot survive where respect is absent. If we are going to move forward, it must be with honesty, not assumptions made behind closed doors. Michael stood and wrapped his arms around me with hesitant tenderness, as though rediscovering a language he had almost forgotten. I hugged him back, because forgiveness and boundaries can exist side by side. Then I stepped toward the front door and paused beneath the glow of the entryway light. Snowflakes settled gently across the porch and melted against the sleeves of my coat. I looked back once more at the home where my grandchildren laughed and my son stood quietly reflecting on choices neither of us could undo. I had arrived that evening carrying years of hurt. I left carrying something far more valuable. I finally understood that dignity is not something other people grant you. It is something you choose to protect, even when doing so means teaching those you love how they should have treated you all along.